right, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. I am Jaime Punishill. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for Lionbridge. For those of you who don't know, Lionbridge is one of the world's largest globalization partners, helping our customers localize and translate and adapt content and experiences for the multiple markets that they operate in. So if you're selling products and services cross borders, cross languages, cross devices, in any of the multiverse universe that I'll describe in just a second, then that's what we do for customers. We're also one of the world's largest providers of AI training data services. That is helping organizations collect, annotate, create, and otherwise get data organized and optimized for consumption by any kind of an algorithm, and then obviously test the results and the relevancy and feed that back into the data sciences. So we're the humans in the loop. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about those AI services, although that is very much the future. I'll talk a little bit really today about the importance of a multiverse approach to your e-commerce strategies, and really how to get rid of all the friction that lives inside of the system for your customers as they live across borders, languages, and markets. So with that, let's just dive right into it. Okay, it's a pretty simple story, and I'm gonna move through this fairly quickly because I think there's some great data and some points in here. But the bottom line is this. You simply can't meet customer expectations in today's day and age if you aren't getting world-class with language and localization. This was true before the pandemic, but it has become profoundly true since, and I'll walk you through a few data points just making that argument. Second key area that we'll talk about then was, what is that linguistic excellence? Why is it the key to this global expansion, and essentially why it's important if you're going to take on the many large or global brands and global organizations that are out there that have become experts in globalization, or using that to drive outsized market share really across all of the different markets that they operate in. And ultimately tell you a little bit about how it helps you move faster, how it helps you spend less, and the thing that we care most about is driving sales and customer satisfaction, which leads to repeat sales, by really transforming how you think about globalization, localization, and frankly your content strategy to operate across markets. So let's dive right into it. Couple of key things. You simply can't you can't meet customer expectations without getting world class about this. And this really means reframing your mindset to have a view of the entire planet as your customer base. All 7 billion people on the planet is your TAM, which means you've got to put language and cultural adaptation right at the centerpiece of your go-to-market strategy. And that's because it is essential to creating frictionless paths to purchase. We know this is a really big important trend in the universe today. You simply cannot be frictionless if you've created language barriers or currency barriers or market-specific buying preference barriers in the way of your buyers. You simply will lose them all along the way. I'm sure many of you are obsessed about crafting exceptional customer experiences. Customer experiences, as you know, are entirely emotional. They are not rational decisions. They are about how people feel about your brand and about the experience. There's nothing more emotional than one's language and one's culture. This is highly personal. In fact, if you're trying to personalize, the number one facet of personalization is in fact somebody's language and culture. And you simply cannot deliver an exceptional customer experience if you haven't adapted your process, your language, your currency, your carts to support those multilingual, multi-market, multicultural experiences. And of course, you wouldn't be here today if you weren't really thinking about how to accelerate your digital transformation and accelerate your e-commerce efforts. The bottom line is this: your digital transformation simply can't succeed if you don't make part of that an internationalization strategy. That is not operating with one market first and then trying to move to other markets second, but starting right away in the way you think about your content, your process, your experiences, your carts, everything. You design it so that it can operate in this multi-market universe. Okay, so let's take a couple of trends that really help accentuate and illuminate why these things are important. So let's start with a couple of things. We know the experience has rapidly become a competitive differentiator. And lots of folks have taken this up to the board level. You're measuring your experience, and the question you have to ask yourself is, can you maintain that experience consistently as you move into new locales, keep it locally relevant so that brand experience and that customer experience, it continues to resonate as you cross those borders and cultures and buying preferences across all elements of the journey. We see this breakdown with lots of folks putting, say, product information in multiple languages or multiple markets, but then customer support doesn't live there. So end to end, the customer experience has got to be adapted to that buyer in that locale. Two, and it's somewhat related, as we see more and more brands going global. Interestingly enough, consumer preference is to buy from global brands that they recognize. Folks would rather buy from a large global organization with a super strong brand if they could. They'd even pay more. They'd pay a premium to be able to do that in their own language. So there's money to be left on the table as you invest in your brand and in trying to elevate that brand across locales, because you've got consumers who absolutely be willing to purchase, but they can't do it when they've got the barriers that are constructed in front of them. So how do you remove those language and currency barriers? I mentioned digital transformation. Again, I don't think I have to tell anybody how critical digital transformation is in today's universe. This is now a board level issue. But it's created another big problem, which is how do you cost effectively operate a digital infrastructure, particularly multiple digital infrastructures, as you go across more channels and more markets. And it requires a rethink in how you exercise this. A couple more trends to consider. We know B2B buyers, if you're in the B2B space, are operating inherently more like B2C customers, even as the B2C customer base and the expectations are skyrocketing. And so if you're operating across the B2B and the B2C universe, I actually think, and there's some research to support this, that it's almost a meaningless distinction at this point. You should start operating with the idea of business to person. But how do you do that when leading players are operating with products or product information in some 30 odd languages? I imagine every one of you is under pressure to produce more content, to drive either more top of funnel activity or to drive consumers through your funnel into leads or into carts and buying experiences, or through those into cart completion and commerce completion. And the question is, how the heck do you maintain the sheer content velocity when you are then having to do it in, say, 30 languages? Keeping that content relevant, keeping it, making it locally adaptable. And this requires an entirely new approach to your content production process that, again, presumes and knows that you're going to operate across those borders, languages, and buying preferences. Think of it a little bit like SEO. You can't do SEO, to perform an SEO process once you've already produced the content and produce an optimally performing piece of content. You need to refactor your brief and the entire way you approach that piece of content. And it's the same here as we think about the internationalization. And finally, we're all going through the revolution towards AI-powered interactions, whether that's VR or AR or speech. Fastest growing consumer application in the history of humankind are speech-activated devices. Whether that's your phone or one of the new home devices, that is changing the way consumers are searching for and consuming content and consuming those experiences. And underneath each of those is a common factor, and that is language and cultural and linguistic adaptation. These three in the middle, the DX digital transformation, the B2B to B2C, and this content explosion, were already big trends and issues for many of us, but they have exploded in the last 6 months as we've taken away locales, we've taken away geographic boundaries, we've accelerated online interactions and commerce in our new remote dominant world, and they are never going away. We've probably seen more change or more adoption in the last 4 or 5 months, 6 months, than we had in the previous 4 or 5 years. and that puts incredible stress on your process. Okay, so I think I've hopefully made the case for what these trends are and why it's important. And what it comes down to is, how do we get good at this linguistic excellence? So let's talk about how this plays out for you, and why it's super important to your customer base. Most of the web content is actually in English, and regardless of what your source content is, whether it's in English or you have another home country where your source content is, what the stats basically show is your content is probably not in the language of the people that you want buying, or as many of the languages as people you want buying. And you can see this if we just look at English for half a second here, how this plays out. While most of the web's content in English, most buyers are not confident in their English, or simply won't visit. We know that they prefer, obviously, content in their native language. They will only buy if, say, user manuals are in English, and/or we can see this in cart abandonment. They're struggling through that process to complete the sale because somewhere along the way they have a language breakdown. All right, and why this is important, if you look at the struts of this graphic, right? This is I stole this from Charles Menard's famous infographic showing Napoleon's march on Moscow. And the reason this is relevant is Napoleon leaves Paris with 400,000 men. By the time he gets to Moscow, which is the right side of this graphic, he's got plus or minus 100,000 men. So he's got 25% of the force he left with, because of all the different things that happened all along the way. And think about that as your user base, or your TAM. You've got this huge potential buyers of a potential pool of consumers or purchasers for your product. But because of just the fact that you don't have your various pieces of the customer journey fully localized or adapted into their language or their buying preferences, you're already at 25% of your possible TAM. By the time in this case, non-English speakers, but your non-host country speakers, by the time they make it through, most of them are falling out, right? And we see that not just in the cart abandonment. We already mentioned how many more would actually would pay, or that they would pay more, both that they prefer those global brands and that they would pay more to have it in their own language. But as importantly, they won't repeat buy if they can't get the customer support in their language. So even if you can get them through the cart one time, you're going to lose them on an ongoing basis. So either way, you've got a far smaller TAM because of this language barrier. But on the way back from Moscow, Napoleon had another problem. And he left with 100,000 men from Moscow, and he ended up heading back to Paris with just 10,000 men. Lots of battles, lots of sicknesses, and other problems. And the same is true even for folks who are doing some work around localization, paying some attention to operating in multiple markets, but really not doing it with this globalization mentality in mind, where internationalization is the centerpiece of the way you construct customer experiences or digital experiences. And you can see this in poor translation, poor localization, in vastly underperforming SEO, obviously in a lot less visibility and less traffic. You see it play out on page with higher bounce rates and lower CTRs. At the same time, it's actually costing you more money. There's a lot more campaign rework when this wasn't set up properly in the beginning. Often those campaign cycles take longer. They cost more money, either the campaign itself or in your localization. Your teams are exercising more effort because often this is more manual. And what's most disturbing in many ways is when you're through all of that, even when you've made all of that effort, on average, we find that only 4% of internationalized content ends up on brand inside of an organization. So either way, either you're not doing the language process and leaving a lot of money at the table, or you're doing it poorly or incompletely and leaving even more revenue on the table. And I don't think I have to tell anybody that that's easy money that we're just leaving behind. It's easy money and it's serious money. And ultimately, you're just leading to poor customer satisfaction and lost sales. This is not small dollar figures, by the way. These are big dollars, and I promise you that the larger competitors who are seeing outsized growth right now are putting this at the centerpiece of the way they attack the market. On average, leading global brands are localizing roughly around 30 languages. That's double in the last decade. So they're competing in 30 markets, and they're doing it in a locally relevant way. And increasingly, we can see that the global leaders are really trying to compress localization turnaround times, so that they are almost operating inside of the digital universe, or that's a multi-channel CX universe, across the globe in real time. And we experienced that really just this week, right? You think about even just a couple of years ago, how Apple would have launched the iPhone. It wouldn't have been globally in every market, all at the same time. That's a great example of an organization who's constructed their supply chain and their go-to-market model to be able to deploy across the globe in 30 plus markets on a single day. That's a tremendous feat. Whereas in the old days, what we would have seen is launches in the US and then kind of moves its way through multiple markets. As you do that, obviously that's lost sales and lost opportunity, which is why we see these turnaround times being radically accelerated. The middle column really shows you just how much money we're talking about. But just localizing product descriptions, I give you multiple case studies and ROI business cases that will show that just localizing your product descriptions and the currencies alone is going to lead to a 40% increase in sales per market. And for those of you who are marketers in the audience, who are fighting to just improve 0.5 or 1%. Of sales with cart optimization or A/B testing on your pages, etc. Think to yourself how hard it would be to get a 40% lift. And yet we can see that when you get those product descriptions and currencies, you're going to get a 40% lift in each of those markets. When you add manuals and customer service, again, these are all approximates, but you're going to add even more to the revenue pile. And ultimately, if you're optimizing that path all the way across the board, starting with SEO and visibility, straight through to site conversion, all the way into the cart and the post-sales cycle, we think there's as much as 20% more lift there. That's a lot of lift when you do internationalization super well, which is your strategy plus your localization, which gives you in-market execution. You're also overpaying, right? You're overpaying multiple agencies. I already talked about the campaign extra costs and the rework. And the costs associated. So whether it's speed, it's effort, or it's hard dollars, either way, you are overspending and under yielding on your multi-market strategy. Okay, let's keep moving. Right, the slide really at its essence is talking about the crux of the challenge, which is how do we create something that's globally consistent, globally operationally efficient, which allows us to move at speed and scale with the quality and with the brand consistency that all organizations want. And at the same time, allow for the local freedom and the local flexibility to make sure it's incredibly relevant, you're highly agile and adaptable to the exigencies of individual markets, and the tension between those two things. Okay, they are not, and I think for a long time they've been positioned and or believed to be either ors, and it is an and both. And we can see more and more organizations figuring out how to create that what the military calls being in command but not in control, right? Where clearly senior leaders cannot be dictating what happens out at the edge inside of a battle in real time. So they've got to enable the local teams or the on-the-ground teams with the right principles, tools, and information sharing and supply chain so they can operate in real time, but overall the leadership is still in command of what's happening and the entire battle. And that's a really good metaphor and sort of model to think about here. Leaders focus on the global consistency, realizing that that consistency matters. It plays to the preferences of consumers who want those global brands. But while they need that consistency, they've got to create enough adaptability and agility at the edge for quick adaptation to meet the needs of local markets. And you can do that by changing the way you think about this and your process. Okay, so let's talk about, practically speaking, why this is such a challenge, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to solve it. And I'm always happy to take questions as we go along here, right? But just a simple example to show just why this is so difficult. If you take something as simple as a 20, I shouldn't say as simple as, but you take a 20 language site, which is, as we can see, not uncommon, and you've got a content library that's got 2,000 items in it, you end up with 40,000 possible combinations. And just to play that out, let's say you're just going to sell a sweatshirt. It's a lovely blue sweatshirt. Of course, customers want it in more than one color. They're going to want it in 4 colors. And so you've taken one piece of content and you've turned it into 4, right? Of course, those 4 sweatshirts need to come to life in many, many different ways, from user manuals to video, describing the product, to comparisons, to point of sale material, to images, et cetera, et cetera. And so you've got this content explosion where you take those 4 items, push them across the many media and the many channels that you have to distribute them in, and you've now got lots more a lot more pieces of content to put together. And that's before we've added the language dimension. And let's imagine you just put 6 languages or 6 markets, as you see here. Worse, if you take those markets, in Spain, you might need both Spanish and Catalan. We've got India on as a flag on this screen, and to hit the bulk of the Indian market, you would need some 22 languages, which is what you would see, say, a piece of Netflix content in the Indian market be represented in the 22 official languages. So that's a lot of languages, and radically what you do is you take those 4 sweatshirts just in those colors across all those channels, and you raise it to the power of language, and you now have a logarithmic challenge, right? As represented here by putting the flags in all those different channels. Okay, I know we're coming up just at the end here, so I want to get into some recommendations for how to attack this, and then if there's some questions, leave just a few minutes for that. So there are really top 5 root causes for your global content failure. I've got them up here on the screen. I think many of us suffer from the siloed decision making and resource planning. I'm going to illustrate this just in a second in a case study, but that is one of your big barriers. Probably the most common barrier is you didn't have a global framework to begin with. That is, most companies still operate as what I would describe as multinationals. You have your home market, and then you have other markets, and they really operate as independent entities. And often when products or services are created, they start in the home market and then they cascade their way through the other markets. And that's a multinational approach. But that's really rooted, if you think about it, in the old industrial mentality, the physical world mentality of localities and things that we touch. The digital universe is 2-dimensional by default. And in fact, the e-commerce experience is 2-dimensional by default. The entire planet is your possible customer base right out the gate. And so if you shift from that multinational to this global view where right out the gate, we're going to operate in multiple markets, you have to set your site up differently. You set your process up differently. You've got a whole people strategy that's quite different. And that's what separates the leaders from those who struggle, is you have to pivot the entire process to operate differently. So you need that global framework. Related to that, of course, is you need control over how that content, particularly the branded materials, end up being represented in the other markets. With global brands comes global expectations. And as stuff gets adapted into one market, if it doesn't resonate and hit the same emotional tenor as was happening in the home market with the original agency work, obviously that's a miss, and you'll have lower sales as a result, lower brand affinity. Quite often there's no visibility, frankly, into the global customer discussion. So think about a multilingual social sentiment analysis exercise, quite difficult, usually managed by market. What that means is you don't have a global view of the different customer feedback, both commonality as well as differences. And again, living with the lack of global control theme, there's usually no global controls over the total global content spent, either the process to produce that content or the process to localize. And all of this leads to poorer content, lower sales, longer turnaround times, and more expense. You really want to focus on 3 areas here. You want to focus on improving discoverability, and that is really both your global and your technical search capabilities. How can we make sure that your content is discoverable and it's relevant, and that you're hearing and being able to observe the global feedback loop that you have in the form of social listening, right? You got your content production process itself, which is how do we make all the content culturally relevant, locally relevant and compliant, and that we've engaged in adaptive design and creative transformation, which could be translation, but it could be transcreation, or it might even be some native content production, right? And smart firms are figuring out how much they can translate, what the next tier, which is a smaller pool of content, needs to be transcreated, which is a full adaptation, not just the words, but the meanings and maybe the imagery. And then in quite a few cases, you're going to want to create specific specific content rather, just for individualized markets. That should be the thing that you do the least of, because it's the most effort. It's also the most impactful. And so you sort of think about this, sort of 80, 15-5 kind of mentality. Then you now are operating with a global content strategy. You're also going to have to pivot your technology, whether that's a PIM or a CMS or a DAM, or frankly the way you even set up your front end templates. If you aren't using hreflang properly, if you aren't setting the site up properly to make it easy to adapt and to localize, again, you're just extending timelines, you're creating less agility, and you're costing more money. Let's just look at this in a quick case study. A customer of ours, Ski Star, who both sells ski passes as well as gear and rentals and schools in many, many markets. They had 7 different markets, none coordinating, separate budgets, producing individual bits of content, individual translations, lots of things off brand, a lot of manual processing. By moving to a full PIM construct and standardizing their data schema and going at this with an internationalized approach, and then using us to pull the data out of the PIM and to create an optimized localization process, excuse me, what they were able to do is reduce their turnaround times by 90%. So basically, it used to take them 61 days to create a piece of content in the source language and get it translated out into their other markets, and now it was 6 days. So they're in market much, much faster because they now have global controls over their translation costs, and they were centralizing things that gave them both an optimized process as well as pricing power. And perhaps most importantly, they were to create 50% more capacity within their existing teams to focus on creating new content as opposed to managing the process of adapting it to all of the different markets. So faster, cheaper, with less effort, and ultimately driving more sales and happier customers. So win on all fronts. Okay, I started this and I'm going to end it the same way. You want a frictionless path to your customer journey. You want high quality customer experiences, and you want to accelerate digital transformation. And underneath that, you're going to need linguistic excellence and an internationalized view to your people, your process, and your technology. And with that, you can unlock quite a bit of growth in each of your markets, in sales, in higher NPS or other satisfaction scores, and with much greater retention. Okay, that is the end of my formal comments. We're just about right at the half hour and right at the bottom of the hour. And I'm looking at the questions, and it doesn't look like we have too much, but I'm here if I can elucidate anything that I talked about or anything else that would help. I am not seeing anything. think we probably have about another minute here before this thing is going to shut down. Oh, here we go. All right, let's see. Interesting question, Emily. Non-native linguists. So, Emily, I think the answer to your question, hopefully everybody can see that over there in the Q&A. It's about the value of linguists and editors who are native speakers to that language versus other linguists who perhaps have learned a second language. And I don't think this is an either or. We're in a universe where there's so much content. And there is so much content, frankly, that isn't being translated or localized for that matter, that I think there's a place for both of those things. All right, and I think this gets at the heart of hopefully the point of the entire discussion here, which is if only 10% of your content and is making its way out of whatever the source language is into destination languages, there's a huge opportunity to pick and choose what is the absolute most essential, has to be perfect, needs those native speakers, and therefore deserves that level of quality, QA process, and cost. But there's a vast array of content like user reviews that would be super useful to buyers that you simply can't get the business case to translate all of that content or localize all of that content, just given the sheer volume of content that's in the world today. So this, to me, is a question really about how do we use our best and most capable resources for the absolute most important pieces, and recognize there's other things that are also important, but they're of lesser importance, and there are other tactics, whether it is non-native linguists or it is AI-based translation, machine translation, whether that's supervised or unsupervised, that for certain content types is good enough, because to the buyers, frankly, even adequately translated, say, user reviews would be better than no translated user reviews. And you can see that Booking.com and quite a few others have proven this out with a pretty strong ROI. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and both, and they both bring tremendous value to the buyers. Any other questions that I can answer before they shut us down here? It is surprisingly uncomfortable sitting here waiting for a question to come through. All right, it looks like we might have exhausted the questions. Thank you very much for your time today. Hopefully this helped make the business case or helped illuminate the importance of this. This isn't really optional. If you're going to operate in the digital universe today and you're going to operate across borders, this has gone from a secondary consideration to a primary one. And if we can help illuminate some process improvements or share some of this data, I'm more than happy to help. Feel free to reach out to myself or to anybody at Lionbridge. You can find us in social media and in 10 languages on the web. We are drinking our own champagne, as the case may be. So with that, I'll just thank everybody and wish you a good day and a good rest of your sessions.